ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Nora Young.
Great to see you again, Nick. Thank you. And yeah, it's not every conference organizer who asks you to answer a question like, if government is the application, what's the operating system? So thanks for that easy question. Thrilled to be here at Creative Connections. It's such an important topic, and I think we all can agree, it's one that's like so surrounded by a kind of mythology and a lot of kind of floaty notions about what creativity consists in. This almost mystical aura, but you know, we're actually starting also to get some pretty good science in how creativity works. Now I have to say before we get started, maybe this is a Fredericton thing, asking presenters to do something difficult. This is my first time speaking about this subject, so please be kind to me. There we go. So I'm not an expert on creativity. I'm going to be upfront about that straight off the bat. But I have, as Nick suggested, been lucky enough to interview a lot of people who are experts on creativity and innovation for my show Spark. So what I'm going to do today is pull together some of the themes from, 10 years of making the show. So I'm going to be citing a few specific examples, a few specific theories of people, but in some cases they're just sort of themes that have come up again and again that seem to be things that really sort of strike a chord. So this will be a bit of a synthesis and a bit of citing specific examples. And I also want to share with you some of what I've learned from making my own show, Spark, and some of the challenges that we faced when it comes to being creative and especially staying creative, which is, I think, anyone who is involved in a creative enterprise, which is to say all of us, knows that that's the real tough part of it, is staying creative. And finally, for those of you who haven't heard Spark, it's a show about technology, about the human dimension of technology. So I'm going to finish by talking about where we find ourselves now in our current technological moment. And then there's time for Q&A at the end, and I'm going to be around all afternoon, so hopefully we can have a good yak. I find that when they do let me out of the studio occasionally, I find that's where some of my best ideas come from, is from talking to people who are in different disciplines. So I hope we'll have a chance to chat. So before we get to all that, I want to play you a little bit of audio, and I have to go over here to do that. So let's see if you can hear who or what is this. Any guesses?
Early radio.
That's close. So you might have recognized that as a human voice. You probably couldn't tell that that person was singing Clair de Lune. And you almost certainly didn't know that that voice was a man named Edouard Léon Scott de Martinville. That is, however, a voice recording that he made way back in the 19th century. He made it 20 years before Edison produced the first phonograph. Yeah, that's really old audio there. So my question is, why do we know the name Thomas Edison and not the name Edouard Léon Scott de Martinville? Edison clearly was king when it came to turning creativity, innovation, and invention into something practical, something that had the power to connect with lots of people. And that's certainly what successful innovators do. They don't just think up great ideas, they get them into the world and make them a reality. But that's only part of the story when it comes to these two guys. This spring, NPR and the great show All Tech Considered dug up a fascinating thing about the invention of the phonograph, which is that in spite of the fact that both de Martinville and Edison created the same technical breakthrough, more or less 20 years apart, it didn't occur to either one of them that it would be used for recording music and playing it back later, which is kind of amazing, right? De Martinville, NPR reports, simply wanted to see what sound looks like. And if you think of that as a creative guy, right? I want to see what sound looks like. I want to find an audio analogy for taking a photograph or a daguerreotype. Edison was working on improving the telephone. The notion of recorded music was just not on their radar, which is particularly amazing when it comes to Edison, who, as I say, was famous for the practicality of his inventions. And I use this example because it makes, I think, an important point about creativity and innovation. We have this mythology that there's a person called a creative genius who's somehow able to do this mysterious thingamajig, like have creative ideas all on their own, whether that's making great art or coming up with an amazing invention. From everything we know now, that's just wrong. Creativity isn't a solitary gift. It happens in a social context. De Martinville and Edison didn't fail to see that they were creating something that was ideal for playing back music because they were stupid. Clearly not. They failed to see it because creativity and the uses to which innovation is put is nested in culture. It's not separate from it. And this is why it's so often difficult for us to see what's around the corner. This is the space where creativity and innovation meet. Creativity as the ability to come up with an amazing, fresh idea, a way of doing, or a thing. Innovation as the ability to see how this fits into the culture and how to make it a reality. As Hegel said, wisdom comes very close to the end of the process. It's very difficult to see what's in the future when you're right in the middle of it. So the question when we think about how to be better at creativity and innovation is how do we get better at that process of opening up our minds, at seeing the potential for a new idea or a new way of doing things that are nascent in the culture but not yet widespread, so that we can spread that way of seeing, so that it's not just the province of a few individual innovators or an innovative startup in my world, but so it's the way a whole community sees its future. It's clear that we're in the middle of this period of exceedingly rapid change, mostly fueled by technological change. So how do we get closer to being the people who have the creativity to invent the phonograph, but also the cultural insight to know that the damn thing is for playing back music? So here are some top lessons that I've learned in how to develop your creative muscles. Among the biggest myths we have, as I alluded to, is that there are certain people who just are creative and certain people who aren't. Creativity isn't a thing, it's a process. And anyone who has ever sweated blood and worked through the process of bringing something to life knows this. It's a process. The fundamental starting point in that creative process is openness and receptivity. A couple of years back, I interviewed David Usher, who's probably best known as the lead singer of the 90s band Moist, but he's also a tech innovator. He gave the example of what he does is to open himself up, is he does something completely different from what he would normally do. And the example he gave in the interview was he goes to see modern dance, which he normally doesn't like at all, but he finds it just switches his whole perspective. So that's what he does, but really pretty much anyone who does creative work does this kind of thing. Years ago, I talked to the choreographer Twyla Tharp. She has this method that she calls box, which is literally just a cardboard box that she throws thoughts, images, fragments of ideas into, anything that has what she calls heat. She doesn't try to close it down. She doesn't try to label it. She just sticks it all in the box, and then when she's looking for something to spark her up, she opens the box and looks for what all those things say to her and what kinds of connections she can find amongst all those things. Personally, for me, when I'm trying to come up with a new project or an idea for a show, I call it putting the antennae up. It's just a kind of different stance that you have when you go out into the world, right? You go out into nature, you go out into the city street, whatever your thing is, and you just feel yourself opening up to experience and to not judging experience. And there's a reason why so much of the advice about creativity is maddeningly vague, because it is this kind of process and not a thing. And furthermore, everyone's process is a little bit different. The young adult writer Philip Pullman, for example, this is the English writer who did the His Dark Materials series, which is an excellent series. They had a profile of him in the New York Times Magazine recently. And he has this whole kind of nutty process that he goes through. He has a specific desk, which no one's ever taken a photograph of and no one ever will. He has a specific type of pen, a specific kind of paper he uses. And when he ran out of that kind of paper, he had to search the globe, and finally he found a company in Canada that makes the right kind of paper with the right number of holes in it. And he said he got about enough for it to last him 10,000 years. He also has what he calls in the New York Times his magic bits, including a magnifying glass and what's mysteriously described as a scientific apparatus. So you probably don't need an astrolabe or whatever on your desk to do your best creative work, but you probably do something to put yourself in that space, something that respects the process. For me, I have a terrible problem with self-censorship and with choking, so I do what's called the Pomodoro method. Set the timer for 25 minutes, write for 25 minutes, and then take a little break, because I find that if I leave myself governed by time rather than the quality of what I produce, it helps me not to choke. And it seems to me, if we take it from the individual to the institution, the problem is often that as institutions, we don't actually have that ritual or process around how to create. So when we come together as a group and we say we're going to come up with an idea for, a new university program or a new radio show or whatever, it feels awkward and super scary because we don't have the equivalent of, the magic bits and the special paper that sit on our desk. And in fact, if you look at great design firms or great tech innovators, they actually have processes that's articulated and understood for how they approach creativity. So as I'll describe in a minute, Google, for instance, has a very clearly articulated approach to how they take work from brainstorm to projects. So that openness in the beginning is hard to do, first of all, because most of us are so busy, we don't really have the time and space to open up like that. We have deadlines, we have regular products, we have classes to teach, and so forth. But also, and perhaps most crucially, we have so many fixed ideas about how things are supposed to work, what a radio show is supposed to sound like. It's hard to get out of your own process and the blinders that accompany all that. And it's no wonder that we see in our era of digital revolution industry after industry after industry being disrupted, right? It's so hard to respond. And we look from the outside and we think, hey, music industry, why aren't you reacting to what's going on? Taxi industry, dating industry, whatever it is. Industry after industry, the dominoes tumble because of that problem of getting, almost outside of your own skin. And companies try all kinds of strategies to get around this. That's why innovative companies have things like skunkworks or sandbox as a way of trying to remove the normal order and the conventional processes. In fact, before I started working on Spark, I was doing a lot of freelancing for CBC, sort of in between the DNTO years and the Spark years. And what really struck me when I would go in and guest host is that all the different shows had these very clear, if not entirely articulatable ideas about what fits their show. This is our show, this is not our show. What story fits, what story doesn't fit. Whereas from the outside, it didn't seem at all apparent as to why this should be so, right? Why does this story fit on this show and not on this show? And on the one hand, this is great. Everything can't be about everything, and that's what gives shows or products or artworks their distinct personality. But it also shows this fundamental challenge with creativity, which is that you need to untether yourself from all these assumptions. Tina Seelig, who's a management professor at Stanford, so definitely someone who's thinking about the practical applications of creativity, she takes this idea of openness and ambiguity one step further, and she advocates not just being open and thinking about what the answer to the problem is, but being open to what the very question is. And before you rush to think about, let's brainstorm what the answer is, let's open up the field of possibility to what the actual question that we're trying to answer is. And of course, the challenge to this is time, especially for anyone who has to pay any of the bills that are associated with all of this stuff, because all of this openness needs not only space, but time. It's very hard to force yourself to be creative, but it's also not a thing that can come out of the blue like a light bulb idea. It does need that kind of time, that luxury of time and space. So I think that as individuals and maybe as institutions, we can all get better at that kind of openness piece. But on the other hand, some people really do seem to be creative types. That doesn't mean it's not something that people can learn, but there do actually seem to be creative types. And this was really, because I've always thought, well, everyone can just be creative. You just have to learn how to do it. But I think if you want to understand creativity, get Scott Barry Kaufman and Carolyn Gregoire's book, Wired to Create. Kaufman is a cognitive psychologist, and in their book, they look at what science says about what we might call the creative mind or the creative disposition. So how do we look at the kind of disposition that people that we recognize as creative have and look for ways to kind of draw on that and support it in our own practice as individuals and also in organizations. And early on in the book, he talks about the so-called Big Five personality traits. This is the big thing that psychologists always talk about: extroversion, agreeableness, openness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism. Unsurprisingly, given what we were saying before, openness to experience is one of the traits that artists and people in creative fields tend to have in abundance. Curiosity, tolerance of novelty, ambiguity. And I would say right now that those of you who are feeling chuffed because you have that high tolerance for ambiguity, artistic types also tend to score high on neuroticism, so don't get too full of yourself there. So we have to think about what, as individuals, can we do to increase our tolerance for that sort of scary world of ambiguity? What can we do to spark that sense of curiosity and our comfort with that? And while I was researching this talk, I started thinking about what that might look like in practice in a workplace, for example, since, of course, we want diverse teams. And believe me, as a person who scores high in openness to experience, you do not want a team full of people who are like all just open to experience. That doesn't work very well. So the challenge, I think, is to create environments that actually support ambiguity and openness, at least in the beginning, because so many people find that a very scary place to be. I'm sure we've all been in those brainstorming sessions where everyone's excited, but there's a couple of people who are just really manifestly uncomfortable with the process, and they're going to say what is wrong with every single idea, why it can't be done. They're going to poke holes in everything, right? Which we all know is a giant buzzkill when it comes to creativity. And of course, there's the point where you need to sharpen your pencil and you need to be critical and all that kind of stuff, but that's not at that openness stage. So when we're trying to support creativity, maybe we look at who's at the table when the very early open period is going on, or maybe the whole team can be present, but we figure out how to lower the anxiety level of being in that ambiguous space. So it's a safer place for people who are not naturally comfortable with it. And I referred earlier to how Google does their brainstorming. They do all the things that we're told that you're supposed to do when you're brainstorming. They don't say no to things. They generate as many ideas as possible. They think big. But after they have the brainstorming session, and I've never come across this anywhere else, they immediately go and they start creating prototypes. They don't just think about it. They actually go out and do it. Now, they're engineers, so prototyping comes naturally for them, but I think it comes naturally for artists as well, right? It's the preliminary sketch, the noodling around that you do with your instrument and so on. And I think this is a really important insight because I really do believe that you learn by making stuff, not by talking about making stuff. And I think that this may be a way institutionally to bridge the gap between those pro-open ambiguity people and the people who are less comfortable with it. Because the ambiguity people, like me, we're curious about things, so we're perfectly happy to sit and talk about ideas until the cows come home. That's my favorite thing to do in the world. If I never had to make anything, I would be super happy. So, wouldn't we all? But having those people who have an interest in actually making it into a reality, making prototypes, I think is a really interesting way to think about building teams that can engage in creative thought together. And that brings us to this idea of moving from open to closed. This is also an insight from Kaufman and Gregoire's book, people who brought us the openness to novelty and ambiguity as a personality trait of creative people. But they also found that creative people have this other thing. They don't just dream about things. They also have this facility, he argues that the science shows, in toggling between these states of open and closed, right? We have this weird idea that artists are just people who are like looking up at the stars all the time, and then suddenly some brilliant idea pops out. But anyone who knows artists know that they work really hard when it comes time to turning something from that open space to the closed space. They narrow things down, they critique ideas, they refine, they try again, they throw it out, they start over, they start over, they start over, they start over. And they're relentlessly inside the process of frustration when something just isn't working. So artists in particular, I think, because they don't have those institutional structures around them often, they need to be exceedingly disciplined and hardworking because of that difficulty of turning ideas into reality. And I really, this is not very helpful advice. Believe in accidents, I admit, but I'm a firm believer in happy accidents and keeping your eyes open to when things happen that you are not actually expecting. And the case of Edison and de Martinville is far from unusual. There are countless examples of people coming up with an idea And, the real use for that idea that should have been staring them straight in the face, but somehow it wasn't obvious to them. So you can think about examples in the tech world. YouTube started as an online dating service. Slack was an internal communications tool for a video game company until they realized that what their business was running a communications tool company and not a video game company. And that's not because they were not innovative or not creative. That's part of the inherent nature of innovation. Haven't we all had that experience? You're working on something and it's sort of working, you think you've got something happening there, and then suddenly you make this tiny change. There's like a shift in perspective or a second piece of the puzzle that comes in, and suddenly it's like, wow, now everything makes sense, right? And I think that's just part of it, is embracing those other pieces of the puzzle, those serendipitous things that come into the process. One of the biggest, most dangerous myths, as I've suggested, is that there's this solitary genius in a lab somewhere inventing things. But the reality is that there's rarely a single person who invents things out of whole cloth. And the fact that they don't invent out of whole cloth doesn't mean that there aren't profound innovations to be had. The science writer Stephen Johnson, in his book Where Good Ideas Come From, is the clearest articulation of this idea. He describes innovation instead as what he calls a kind of bricolage, right? Which is creating something new from stuff that's already ready to hand. And as he argues, this, just because you're not inventing it out of thin air doesn't mean it's not important or not exceedingly innovative. And his most famous example in the book is the movable type printing press. So as he tells the story, Gutenberg had trouble and was struggling with how to actually make a working press work. And it wasn't until he was hanging out in a vineyard and he observed the use of the ancient technology of the screw press for pressing grapes that he realized how he might actually come up with creating a printing press. And surely none of us would say that Gutenberg's press was not a groundbreaking innovation, even if it actually drew on this kind of bricolage, as Johnson would say, these things around him. And I think we've all had these moments that strike me as really true when those things fall into place. I always think of it as being like the feeling of what it must be like to be a safecracker, when you're listening to the things tumbling and then suddenly you have that little click and you know that the safe is going to open. Not that I'm a safecracker, but so yeah, it's that shift in perspective and the willingness to acknowledge that you need to keep your eyes open for that shift in perspective. And beyond collaboration with other people or beyond the kind of bricolage Johnson's talking about, especially in the early going, it's the so-called end users who create most or much of what something is actually used for. So for example, the now ubiquitous hashtag was not something that Twitter created. It was created by a user named Chris Messina. Now, Chris Messina is a former engineer at Google, so he's not just, your average random Joe. But he suggested it to Twitter. He didn't patent it. It was just a thing that came out of, I think this would be a good idea to group things together by topics. 10 years ago, maybe, there was a ton of hype about crowdsourcing, much of which has died down. But it's still the case that the internet and the ability to create platforms on which people build stuff is still the source of incredible participation and innovation by users themselves, and our ability to especially in the early going, to harness that power of the broader community is exceedingly powerful. I want to return to this idea of how much work creativity is, because I think it's really important that we embrace. And I think in particular, when you're making arguments to institutions, and you're making arguments for why institutions actually need to pony up and contribute money to things that involve creativity. I interviewed Kevin Ashton for Spark a while back. He's the guy who invented the term Internet of Things. He did a lot of early work on the RFID tag, so an innovative guy. And in his book, How to Fly a Horse, and in his interview with me, he basically denies that there's any special fairy dust to creativity at all. He claims it's just hard work. As he says, creative thought is just thought. I'm not an artist, but I have many friends who are, and the one thing that a number of them came up to me and said that really resonated with them in that interview was that Ashton talked about the importance of saying no. That if you're innovative, a lot of what you're doing is saying no to going to the cottage, no to taking a break for a coffee. As my friend, the illustrator Alana Kavanaugh, said to me, it's about going to an art gallery and going home right away to work instead of going out, because you've just filled your head with ideas and you need to get them down. And for any creative person, that's going to be hard, because not only is it hard for anyone to say no, it's hard to say that in a society that thinks creativity is just some magical thing that happens. I've never forgotten, this is going back pre-Spark, many years ago, the musician Hawksley Workman talking in an interview we did about the importance of the regular practice for him of songwriting. And he described it as making sure the path to the woodshed is clear, so you can get there when you want. You know, maybe you don't have a great idea on a given day, but you're wearing down that path so it's easier to get to the next time. So the bottom line in creativity, which no one who pays things wants to hear, is it takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of hard work, and there are always failures along the way. There's a reason why so many artists are broke, which is that you can't be a Bay Street trader for 3 days a week and spend 2 days a week creating great art. It just takes time. So the reason I picked some of those interconnected lessons is partly because they've come up again and again through the 10 years of making Spark. But I've also thought about these models in my own work making Spark. And I just want to talk a little bit about that just as an example of it in process. Back in 2007, I had an idea for a show I wanted to make about technology. It was going to be a show that could be critical, but had a sense of optimism at its core. It would engage its community of listeners and social media connections. It would be fun, it would be creative. But how did I get from an idea in my head to a thing on the air in the real world? Well, the first thing is happy collaboration. I had an amazing pair of people to work with, Elizabeth Bowie and Dan Meisner, both Atlantic Canadians, by the way, where we would let ourselves be open to creative play, to trying new things. And not a coincidence, I think, that Elizabeth had a background in acting and Dan in music. They were used to play, experimenting, and collaboration, and importantly, risk-taking. Second was institutional support. In the early going, the show was, to be honest, kind of weird, hopefully lovably weird, but weird. And if we hadn't had the support of our manager, Linda Groen, it would never have got off the ground. Third is community and community participation. Early on, again, this is 2007, an active community emerged around the show of people involved in what we then called Web 2.0. They worked hard to help us get the show off the ground. They blogged about it. We solicited content from them. We took our audience seriously as collaborators, even when that felt a little bit scary. And then that process of closing down and learning to focus. And there's nothing like the discipline of having to get a show on the air every week, and the show that has to be a certain length to make you actually say, enough trying things, we have to put the baby to bed. Or indeed, there's nothing like messing up on the air and being called on it to teach you a lot about crossing your I's and dotting your T's. Other way around. But 10 years on, we find ourselves with a very different challenge, one that, to be honest with you, we're still in the middle of. So how do you rethink and reinvent when your context has changed? In our case, when digital technology and culture has gone from being this coming new thing to what's changed virtually every Canadian's life. How do you adapt and look for the new thing when you're already a bird in flight and when you're already making a new show every week? And with, by this time, a very different set and also another set of very talented people. And now I'll be honest with you, we've really, really struggled with this. And what I feel in myself anyway is the tendency to double down on what you already do as your core. But I've come to believe that chasing after what you once were, trying to go back, is not successful. The only thing I can say, and it's something that I say we're still struggling with, is embracing a kind of humility. Learn from what others are doing. Look for the thing that feels like it's got energy, even if that sounds a bit, frothy. Recognize that you're not going to get where you need to be until you can really come together as a team. And this is maddeningly fluffy, I know, but we didn't come close to living a new vision and finding new modes of creative storytelling until we really connected as people. And it's interesting, I was at an excellent session this morning with Patrick Mason, who was talking about project management. And his starting point was about relationships, about the importance of building that really strong connection with other people before you do anything else, basically. In our particular case, we were all going along, doing our own thing, talking about the need to collaborate and be creative without actually being able to do it. And it was only when, to be honest, something screwed up really badly and we all had to come together and recognize that we had to rely on each other's skills that we form that real connection. And I think this is where a lot of organizations have trouble, precisely this point where talking about collaboration and innovation doesn't translate into action. And I think maybe you actually have to build a system where you can't function without collaboration, because all the brainstorming and team building exercises in the world aren't going to change things if your way of creating and experimenting isn't baked into your actual process. So that's just a little bit of a digression of what I feel I've learned from reflecting on my own experience and how we've covered the creativity question on Spark. People have wrestled with how to innovate and be creative for ages, but of course, what does it mean at this precise moment? So I'm a tech journalist, so when I was thinking about what I might bring to the table for this conference, I thought I'd talk a little bit at the end about what creativity and innovation means specifically in the technological era we find ourselves in right now, which is the era of big data and artificial intelligence. So what do we mean by this big data era? What we mean by big data is basically access to these enormously large data sets that are so large that they don't lend themselves to conventional computation. So an example of this in the case of Walmart, I don't know if people at the back can see this, Walmart processes about 10 million transactions every single day, and they use that to find correlations in the data. The data show them that when a hurricane's coming, people buy Pop-Tarts. They don't know why. They don't need to know why. When a hurricane's coming, they move Pop-Tarts to the front of the store, right? That's an example from the book Big Data by Victor Meyer-Schonberger and Kenneth Cukier. So the promise of this big data is that we have much less need for relying on our gut instincts. And indeed, as in the Pop-Tart case, the data about what our behavior in the aggregate is can show us things that our gut instincts and our desire to innovate might not. So it can actually support the innovative process. After all, who would make that correlation on their own between Pop-Tarts and hurricanes? If we look at the world of entertainment, creativity here is being affected by big data as well. So Netflix, for example, can have great success producing original content because it knows what people who subscribe to Netflix like to watch at an extremely granular level. That's how they can do things like, maybe they're regretting it now, but invest an entire first season of House of Cards without even seeing how the pilot did, because they had enough data on how their users, many millions of users, what they wanted to watch. And the same thing is happening with music streaming. If I'm a musician or a record label with access to the data that music streaming services provide, I can see not only what songs are popular, which is something I would have been able to judge by record sales, it can tell me when people tune out of a song. So maybe a remix needs to bump up the chorus somehow in response to that. And the more we move into this digital world, which we're doing all over the place, the more this is happening. Digital technology knows, in quotation marks, how it's being used in a way that analog technologies don't. It's a condition of being digital. What tech people call the affordances of being digital. If you read books on paper, all anyone knows is how many copies of the books have been sold. If people are reading it in ebook format, Amazon, say, can know how quickly people are reading it. When they stop reading it, not because they're particularly trying to spy on you, but just because it's implicit in returning you to where you left off the next time you turn on your e-reader. I don't know if Amazon sells that data, but they certainly could. Having written a book myself, if I knew that there was a point in chapter 4 that people skipped over or stopped reading, maybe I would try and fix it when the next edition of the book came out. But what does this mean for the distinctly human spark of creativity? From a business point of view, it's led experts like Andy McAfee from MIT's Sloan School of Management to argue that we ought to rely much more on data in the early going and bring in the theory later on, instead of relying on what he calls hippos, which I'm trying to work into meetings as much as I can. HIPPO stands for highest paid person's opinion. And specifically, with reference to Netflix, there's been research done by two scholars at Harvard, I believe, their names are eluding me at the moment, that this Netflix model is actually good for human creators because the data allows the makers of culture to take creative risks that they wouldn't have otherwise. Netflix can commission a whole season because they have the data that backs it up. They can take chances on more risky things because they have reason to believe it'll work. And I think that's likely true. But the challenge, of course, is that if we're always relying on what the data shows us about what's come before, are we ever going to generate something that's actually radically new? And I think that also is an implication of our reliance on data, whether we're talking about a TV show, a piece of music, or what goes at the front of the store when a hurricane's coming. So that's a little bit about the data piece, but what about the AI piece? What does it mean in the age of artificial intelligence? This is a crucial, not only artistic question, but a political question because it's so tied up with the kind of jobs we're going to have. For a long time, AI was good at producing results in very constrained domains. For example, robotics on the factory floor where you could control for a lot of variables. Even when computer scientists started to produce the results that looked like what we would recognize as intelligence, these domains were tight. So for example, in chess, we do and can play chess in the physical world, but it's obviously a very tightly constrained environment, much more rule-bound than our normal physical world. AI was good at doing that, but not very good at doing what humans seem to do in this very natural, gestalt-y kind of way. Things like recognizing that a cat is a cat, even if it's curled up in a ball, even if it doesn't have any whiskers, etc. But something happened a little over 5 years ago. An AI technique called deep learning or neural networks that had been sort of languishing on the fringes of AI suddenly started to produce results in precisely the kind of areas that had previously seemed distinctly human, recognizing that a cat is a cat, understanding what human communication means, even with limited success, doing things like making an image that looks like a Rembrandt or composing a piece of music. And that happened because of this change in AI, which in turn is fueled by enormous data sets. It's hand in glove with the big data revolution. The ability to train AI on gazillions of pictures of cats, for example. So what AI now is good at and getting better is anything that's systematizable, that requires pattern matching and pattern recognition. So we're starting to see AI spread into areas that make us, as humans, uncomfortable because they feel like things that require a lot of what used to be very human skills: legal research, medical diagnosis, journalism. We're even, as we're covering on this weekend's episode of Spark, now automating part of the process of training AIs. That's right, AIs training AIs. What could go wrong? So what is the scope for creativity in this world? Well, frankly, it ups the ante considerably because right now there are 3 domains where we still have it over AI. One is in interpersonal relationships and emotional intelligence. 2 is aptitude and facility and physical skill in the real physical world. And 3, creativity and original thought. So if you're thinking about what career your kid might go into, think about it as like nursing, being an electrician, being a psychotherapist, being someone who's involved in something creative. So the kind of limited creativity that's a form of pattern matching, producing something pretty that you just change the color of, say, is not going to be a human-only skill for very long. AI is already starting to engage in that activity. But genuine creativity, doing something really new, especially that which draws on interpersonal relationships and emotional intelligence, that is fundamentally deeply human. In art, in story, sure, but perhaps also in social movements that connect people to one another in new ways, perhaps in spiritual experiences, perhaps in physical skill, perhaps in care for others. Or more prosaically, in goods and services that perhaps we didn't even know we wanted, but that nonetheless enrich our lives. Honestly, who would have guessed that we needed a platform like Facebook, for example, that connects billions of people around the world and for all its ills, still allows family and friends to connect and reconnect in new ways. Not Mark Zuckerberg, who in his Harvard dorm room only imagined it as a way for students to find dates. So the ability to see potential in innovation and connect it to the emerging culture, that same idea that lets you realize that a phonograph is best purposed for playing music, that's the skill, and knowing how to work with other people in order to develop it, those 2 things together. As scary as this AI-fueled world can kind of be, what I think we're looking at is a huge potential growth in human creativity, and in particular, creativity fueled by radical collaboration. Right? Facebook, to use that example, didn't burst forth like a deus ex machina. It grew as a result of feedback loops between creators and users, between seeing what worked and seeing what stalled, for good and obviously sometimes for ill. But to conclude on an honestly held positive note, which I have to say is not my natural disposition, I think the greatest power may lie in thinking about the future of creativity not as an us versus them war with our technologies, with AI and big data, but how we harness the power of both together. So look at chess as an example of this in practice. This is an insight that comes again from Andy McAfee at MIT, which I learned about when he was talking about the challenges of AI in an interview we did. 2017 is the 20th anniversary of Deep Blue beating the chess master Garry Kasparov. It's now simply true and almost trivial that computers beat grandmasters. It was once considered a triumph of human strategic thinking, chess. However, it's also true, as McAfee explained to me, that there's this growing arena of competition called centaur chess, in which teams of human players and AIs together play other teams of humans and AIs together. And in some cases, those centaur teams have been able to beat not only human grandmasters, but also standalone AI chess programs. So there's something going on there, and again, this is McAfee's insight, that may lie at the heart of the future of creativity and innovation, right? In the case of chess, that the gestalty whatchamacallit that humans do and the processing power and pattern recognition that computers do together may produce superior results to either one. And since we're currently in a university environment, we might think about how we can go forward as centaurs in these kinds of institutions. So what are new ways to bridge the gap between art and science, interpersonal intelligence, and computer science? The transition itself will rely on creativity and innovation, how we reassess and redesign our institutions for this new environment. Indeed, a whole meta level of creativity, creating the system that fosters next generation creativity and innovation. So I return to the lessons that I've learned from talking to experts. Creativity is hard work, it takes time, it flourishes in an environment where people can be open-ended, it's nourished by happy collaboration, and it really only goes from idea to innovation when you're able to go from loose open play to focused hard work. And hard work is not perhaps the most inspiring note to end on, but ask any artist who started again and worked through up to that space where the half-formed thing is real and there and is beautiful, and it makes the whole thing worthwhile. Thank you very much. Thanks. Do we have time for questions or comments? Or yeah. Or as I say, I'm looking for story ideas. Comments. No one wants to be the first. Yes.
Thank you for I feel like some of the things I've been dealing with, this is not like a therapy session.
Oh, yes, it is.
In the last little while, sort of you brought some of these things to light in a new way, not in the way I've been thinking about them, but this sort of us against them mentality and looking at it as happy collaboration. And this is something that I've been struggling, imagining, for the last few months, due to various things going on in life. Because as you say, it's failures and things that go awry that prompt this. So all I want to say is it's wonderful to meet you. And I closed my eyes, not because I was falling asleep, but because I was thinking it's better because I hear you on the radio. So just thanks a lot. There's so much that I wrote down that is just thought-provoking, and that's why we're here, right?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Anyone else have comments or thoughts? Yes?
Your slide that there is no end user.
Mm-hmm.
I'm having a hard time because I'm just like working in projects where I'm trying to get people to think about the end user. Can you just elaborate a bit on what you meant?
Sure. I mean, at one level, from the point of view of design, there is an end user, right? This is how we think about, designers think about empathizing with the person you're designing for. And you have to have that kind of insight into, okay, how are they actually going to use them and do all those things like talk to people and observe how their practice and stuff, so you can try and get close to designing well for those people. So in that sense, yes, there is an end user. But I think when we look at how innovation actually happens, and I think this is especially true as we move into these digital environments, which is that because we have this ability to have these incredible feedback loops of how people are using things, we have this ability to kind of tweak things as we go along on the one hand, but then we also have this ability to kind of take things that people are doing in spaces, right? We design digital tools that people can actually use in novel ways, and they can experiment with it themselves. So I think we actually have an unprecedented opportunity to learn from people in ways that we didn't before, right? There always would have been somebody who was like in their basement using the thing that you designed in a way that you never thought it would be used for, except that now there's this kind of transparency over that. So I think there's a greater ability for collaboration in that sense. Yes?
Thank you for the excellent presentation. I was wondering, I noticed that one word that didn't appear in your presentation was coding. And being in the education milieu, it's often thrust upon us that we need to learn kids to code. So my 3-year-old daughter learned code. And I'm wondering, what's your take on this direction? So is it intentional to leave it out, or do you think that it still deserves?
Yeah. So in case people behind didn't hear, it was a question about coding and the whole language that everybody needs to code and the next generation all needs to code. It wasn't intentional to leave it out. I mean, I think, and I mean, I'm not a coder, and my thinking on this is mostly shaped by interviewing people who do this on Spark, who would say that what people need to understand is the logic of coding. And I think that probably is right. I think what seems to me is that we're moving towards a space where we have lots more tools for people to treat coding as a more modular kind of thing, like where we're giving people tools to do coding logic without having to actually know a specific coding language. And I think that we might be making more moves in that direction in the future. Which really, as far as I understand it, has been kind of the history of coding in general, which is building on top of, right, at higher levels of abstraction. There are, and I'm just struggling because I cannot remember, I think it's called Scratch out of MIT, which is based around doing, I'm seeing some heads nod, which is based around doing this kind of thing. There's a Canadian woman actually who has a startup, and I really won't remember what it's called, but it's designed around doing this kind of thing for hardware, making modular pieces that let young people understand what is the logic of how these pieces of hardware go together without actually having to, necessarily know the nuts and bolts. So to me, that's the important piece. Is it's the logic of it. Great. Thank you very much.
Nora, you've given us a huge amount to think about, and I love how you ended it with creativity is hard work, because when you work in the field of creativity, people are often saying, oh, that's just so easy, that's fun, that's play, it doesn't have any place or meaning in the education world, and in this day and age it's still a comment that's made. And a student of mine recently, I asked him to define creativity, and that's exactly what she came back with. It's hard work. So it was a great realization. So again, wonderful, wonderful presentation, and I think that we came away with a lot of information and new ideas, and very thought-provoking about what is the future in terms of technology and its connection to creativity.
Thank you.
I'd like to give you a small token.
Thank you.
Appreciation.
Lovely.
Thank
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you.